Um, anyone? I think there's Jay is here who came to a similar session about 9 months ago and is now doing a challenge, CivTech, a 9 challenge. So
I
hopefully
am indeed.
they'll chip in at some point with, feel free, Jay, to argue with anything I say or give different perspectives or generally offer, yeah. So I'll just go through a few slides. The first bit is just kind of my understanding of the kind of structure of the system, and then the second bit is the things I've learned or the things I think kind of help build a winning proposal. So apologies if you already know the first bit. I quite like this diagram from their website of what they're trying to do. So they've defined the challenges, so they've done the red block, and we're now in the orange block where they're doing a wide open request for people to come up with ideas. And I think you all know the deadline is, I think, the September, maybe the 10th or so. 6 people from that will get invited for an interview, and 3 of those people will then get £3,000 and £5,000 and 3 weeks to further their idea. And almost always just one team at that point then gets it through to the green stage, which is the 15 weeks, 300 grand. And once you've got through to that stage, you're almost certain to get through to the pre-commercial phase. So I can almost think you can kind of think of yourself at that point of you're in, you even though you've won a £30,000 project, you've actually probably won the full value of the project. I think there was only one example ever of someone not getting from the accelerator to the pre-commercial phase, and that was the organisation themselves deciding not to proceed. As I said before, I think it's absolutely amazing opportunity, particularly if you're trying to build a company, because the intellectual property you own, no one takes any equity. So you get to the end of a year and a half, and you own 100% of what you've created. You've had this in-depth kind of working relationship with someone who has got this problem. And so you really have a kind of world-leading expertise in a certain problem. And at that point, you're free to do whatever you want to go and raise extra funding, or you've turned it into a business. Anything there, Jay, that's kind of you'd flag up?
I think it might be 2 now. I noticed that one of the challenges that had an exploration phase didn't progress this last round.
Oh, okay.
But still, it's a very small number.
Did they not progress because they didn't want to, or because, do you know what happened?
I'm not sure. I think that the sponsor decided not to progress with the challenge, but I don't know exactly what the reasons were. Either way, it's still a small number.
So in terms of the selection process, this isn't going to work. So the application form is slightly changed, because I always used to think one of the best things you could do is spend a lot of time creating a standalone PDF or Google Doc that you link to lots of places, but I see they've now explicitly forbidden that, but you are allowed to put some pictures in the document. So you don't have to worry too much about the sections A, B, C, D, because they're not scored. So it's really about the questions 1 through to 3, and question 1 gets 3 times the score of everything else. So that's really the crux of what you're trying to do. And for me, what's very different about CivTech compared to almost any other kind of government contracts I've gone for is so many government contracts you go for are really about kind of form filling, and kind of they're just looking for either case studies or kind of track record. And it always surprised me, they're not really interested in the kind of nature of what you're suggesting. Coming from more of a startup background where there's a kind of sense of you go to investors and you're kind of pitching a big vision. For me, CivTech is much more like that kind of startup world, where it's more about the story you're trying to put forward and the kind of, can you convince people of a vision that there's something exciting here? And so you have a certain degree of freedom to interpret the brief. I think that you should think of the brief as a starting point rather than a kind of a very tight definition of what's wanted. And then the other thing, which I think probably anyone who's used to doing these sort of applications will think of, but was kind of new to me when I came across it, was it's also pretty good to work back from the scorecard, which is publicly available. And just when you're writing everything, thinking about what they look like. I think the one thing this really helps with is making sure that you avoid. You just need to score highly on every section, and so there are things like thinking about the commercial opportunities and business ambitions, the people in the business, equality and diversity. You have to make sure you've got something good to say on each section, because otherwise you could score a 0, and if you've done well on the other 8 sections or whatever, just being one blank would really kind of impact the measurements. Even though I think they like the kind of big story, they are still coming back to this rubric and thinking about how many points can we give in this section and that section. Does that accord with your experience, Jay?
Yeah, and I think we actually probably won on the basis of that advice that you just gave, like not taking the brief as seriously as you would in other forms of procurement, because our challenge had an implied challenge that was kind of behind what they'd actually written out. And I think the other people who applied for it took a purely technical point of view, and they tried to solve it purely with technology. But there was also a policy problem that underlined the problem that they described. And I think that the thing that appealed to them about our proposal was that we took aim at the policy problem as well. And I don't think that we would have done that if we were just writing a tender for someone like we've done in the past.
And that, yeah, I think that is really accords with my experience, and is one of the lovely things about CivTech is they're looking for the bigger solution rather than the kind of typical procurement where, and I think that's one of my bits of advice was going to be, I think one thing that's really worth doing is, if you're serious about applying for a challenge, is watch the video 2 or 3 times and just really sort of, just because I think there's trying to get under the skin of what they're really asking is worth doing. And then maybe there is that kind of, sometimes there can either be a surface level ask, or there's a kind of they're looking for, definitely one of the 2 ones we won, they had really no idea what the solution was going to be, and so they were just really articulating the problem. The other one we won, I think they were much clearer, much nearer to thinking about what a solution might be. And so with that one, my approach was more to kind of articulate what their solution was, and then articulate where we thought there were challenges around that. So particularly around what needed to be better bottomed out through extra user research, where there were kind of assumptions they were making that they were maybe unaware of. So even in the one where you're sort of being a bit closer to following, you can sort of feel they know what they want and you're trying to answer that, I think you can still put a little bit of, compared to traditional procurement, I think you should sort of stand up and put your own view across a bit more, rather than just being like, yes, we can tick this box, yes, we can tick this box, yes, we can tick this box, because they are looking at that overall solution. Any questions so far on the sort of, that's the general structure? So moving on to tips, and this bit is much more subjective. I think you have to remember it is a competition, and one thing, I had some friends who went in for a challenge last year, and I got the impression there was something about the challenge that just meant hundreds, well, probably not hundreds, but I got the impression dozens and dozens and dozens of people had applied for that challenge. And I've got the impression there's other challenges where there's just far fewer people applying. Now it's very hard to reverse engineer who's yeah, that exactly, that was the one. And I think there's a menopause one that my friends went in for, and I think there was something about it where it was kind of a bit more sort of service designy kind of user. There was, I think the ones that put people off have a bit of something technically hard about them, and people are often scared off by them because they're like, well, I don't know the technical details. But remind yourself that no one really knows the technical details. Oh, that's interesting. Joe's contradicting me there.
I mean, in relation to like hardware, for example.
Oh,
Like
yeah, that's true.
There were a swathe of ones last time and this time that require a hardware angle, which is just always, there's a higher barrier to entry there, isn't there?
I find like some of the people, like the ones I had trouble persuading my team to apply for, are ones where it's like it has to integrate with this system. I think and often a developer's mindset is we don't know anything about that system. What can we say about integrating with it? And I think taking a step back and approaching it from a 30,000-foot view of being, well, it will probably be like a kind of standard CRM, so there'll be a case form or whatever. Let's just draw it up in an appropriate degree of abstraction. So first is, if something seems hard, don't let that put you off, because it probably seems hard to a lot of other people, and so that might actually be a good thing rather than a bad thing if if no one can answer it. The second thing is, I think, always be asking yourself, how can you get ahead of the pack if you're competing against 10 other people? And so when I did CivTech 6, there was a nature of the problem. I was able to create a working demo in that 3-week exploration phase, which was just like way ahead of what other people were doing. The one thing I find is always a great shortcut for getting ahead is doing some user research, because that brings some fresh air into the conversation. It shows that you're kind of closer to the ground, and often it works really well in a pitch because it's just kind of interesting because it's human. Any other tips on this front, Jay? Or Chloe's joined us as well.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much the approach that we took as well. So the two reasons why I think that we won, and we've tried our best to unpack this over the past, like, how long has it been? Like 6 months now since we won it. One of them is the, like, trying to be broader with the problem, which we've already spoken about, and then the other thing is, like, we really, really worked hard during that exploration phase. Like, we didn't take weekends or anything. Like, we worked very, very hard, and I think, like, that was just Chloe and me, and Chloe and I are the co-founders of our company. So, like, there was no quest. Like, we couldn't have asked employees to work that hard in that period of time. But I think we really impressed them with the amount that we were able to get done in the time.
And it does mean there's a bit of a kind of quite a sort of treadmill at the start of the project, because you kind of think, well, I've got to work really hard to be one of the 6 people to get an interview, and then you get the interview and you think, well, now it's worth doing an extra load of work to impress when I do get the interview, so let's, like, redo the deck and do for more user research. And then you think, well, now I'm actually getting paid and I've got a chance of 30 grand, let's really go to town now. And so that first
and now we've got the 720,000, and now we're thinking about getting the renewal, so it never ends.
It's not for people who want an easy life.
It was absolutely ridiculous. I don't think I even texted my mum back for those sort of 3 weeks that we were in exploration. I remember being in the car and, like, driving and doing a user research session on the phone with someone while I was driving in the car, which I would not recommend, just like over the Bluetooth. But, like, when we went to that stage as well, because it is a competition, we were up against 3 really quite well-established companies, one of which was a digital identity specialist company, and
another one had basically written the spec.
The other guy had written the challenge, written a paper that the challenge was based on, and then the other company was a massive government consultancy. So we were just like, we were David and they were Goliath, and I really didn't. All we could do was throw our entire lives into it and see what happened. And somehow we pulled it off.
But I do think, like, that, the advantage you do have as being the David is that you're not constrained by existing technology, existing process, your existing organizational structure, so you can really just create a more vibrant and compelling story about how you'd solve this problem from scratch, and you can move a lot quicker because you don't even have to have a discussion about not taking weekends off. The second tip would be, it's kind of all in the same area, but I think focus on storytelling. It always amazes me, even when you get right to the end of the process, how hard it is to understand what other people are working on. And this is at the end of the sort of 15 weeks when you get a whole load of coaching about how to tell your story, and you work through it with a kind of a specialist presentation coach. So imagine, like, right at the start when it's so much less developed, I just imagine it's like a sea of words for the for the adjudicators if you've got like 10, 20 applications. And I think the two things that helped me, one is particularly with when I did CivTech 8, I had a friend who didn't know the challenge at all, but was really an editor, just thinking about how are we writing this story, how do we make it comprehensible, because there needs to be a dream in your head that you're articulating, and often the first few drafts of getting that dream out of your head are quite they just don't make sense as a story, because it's more like a brain map of your head. And then the second thing is, I think, always falling back to leading with user stories, because that allows you to kind of really construct it's got the human narrative appeal of Fred's having this problem, but also humans are interested in humans, so it makes it more interesting saying Fred's having this problem and here's how we're going to solve it, rather than here's the database structure we're solving, which is a kind of maybe where your brain starts. And also it demonstrates you're user-centered. Everyone wants to be user-centered, but rather than saying that, much better to show it by being like, we've spoken to Fred and Tabitha and Jamal, and this is what the world looks like from their perspective. Over deliver. All these top points were basically the same, variations on the same. I think we've covered this as well. So one good point is, and this isn't really possible if you're one of the 6 shortlisted, but once you get to the final 3 and you've got that 3 weeks and $5,000, I think a really good way to over deliver is to schedule as many meetings with the challenge sponsors as possible, because every time, if you can meet with them once every 4 days and pitch them, hey, here's where we've got to, and they can tell you why it's not right, and then if you get 3 or 4 iterations of that in that 3 weeks, the chances are by the time you're pitching it, it's something that they're really on board with, because they've had 3 chances to say no. It doesn't mean a lot of work, because you have to 3 or 4 times get all your thinking together in a coherent form and show it to them, have done some user research, so you can say, well, you might not like this, but Tabitha does like this, and here's why it makes sense if you're on the ground. In terms of over delivering in this current phase, I think watching that video really, really closely, and then asking as many intelligent questions as you can, which you can do on the Public Procurement Scotland, because then you can, you're starting that loop of thinking, here's what teeing up a question that is kind of nudges to what your solution looks like, and they can then say, no, it doesn't work for this reason. At least you've then got time to iterate on that and think, well, okay, now I understand the problem a bit better, because they're saying this sort of thing doesn't work. Don't get phased. I think this was really, I was thinking of Jay and Chloe's point of when they were on their exploration phase, they were up against some the teams just looked like the kind of dream team of who you'd want to solve this challenge, and yet they're beatable through putting together a good story, working really hard. No one knows everything. People with solutions have got a certain hammer, and that is both a benefit, they're further down the road, but it's also a disbenefit, because they can't really get under the skin of the challenge in a completely flexible way. And also bear in mind, you won't know everything, particularly if there's requirements around integrating with various systems. I'll just wave your hands and draw some very high level diagrams, because that's what the next phases are for. You don't have to think, well, I can't apply for this because I don't know how to integrate with XYZ. Any more on that, Jay or Chloe?
I think if we were to do it again, I would have probably built less during the exploration phase, the early phases, and given the impression of having built more, if you like. So it doesn't actually matter if it works so much. It was important to us at the time that we made something that actually worked. But I might have just prototyped more. So we could have, for example, used more of existing technology and just sort of built on top of it, rather than trying to recreate as much as we did. Focusing less on the tech integration, I think, is the point I'm trying to talk about there.
Yeah, it's really about the story, but that's so easier to say in retrospect, because when you don't know it's hard to avoid that when you're making something, because you kind of want to prove it.
We have a I don't know if this is on topic or not, but we have a line of thinking in our company now, and it's the everyone is just some guy line of thinking. Because you often find, especially in the civil service, Chloe and I have both been civil servants, you hear about people through reputation, and they're like, oh my god, he's wonderful, he's incredible, he's the leading expert on this thing. And I think that this is partly a result of like people's reputations getting ahead of them, and partly a factor of how quickly you can become the expert on a very niche problem like this if it's all that you work on. Because often we would have meetings with these people and they would be just telling us 5 things that we already knew, and we'd end up telling them 10 things they didn't know.
Yeah, it's really true that I love that phrase. You do keep coming across people who, and I think that, that almost you have to battle that imposter syndrome yourself a little bit, because in the first couple of weeks you won't, well, depending where you're coming from, but certainly the ones I've done, never really been the expert, but I've just covered it from a user-centered design storytelling point of view, hoping that you can kind of paper over the cracks and assuming that everyone else is just some guy rather than an absolute
I used to be a consultancy, and Chloe and I ran our company as a consultancy, and we thought that we were experts on the kinds of projects that we kept getting. So in areas like social care, for example, like I thought of myself as an expert on social care technology, and it is surprising, I think, especially to myself, like how much more I'm an expert on this now compared to what I was an expert on that before. So it really does like take your knowledge to a new level very quickly. Like you can become a world expert on whatever the problem is you're tackling very, very, very swiftly.
So the people have recently returned from an American conference on ID technologies.
Yeah, that was a bit wild when we submitted that. I would say don't get phased as well, is that it is surprising what you can do. I would say that we did maybe 40% of the work in pajamas, because we were just at the point where we were like, we can't actually cope with, there's just so much to do and there's only 2 of us. But that one of the things that we did shortly after, before we'd even got the before we'd even heard if we'd won the exploration, was applied to speak about this at a conference, because we were just we were like not phased by the fact that if we didn't win the exploration, we were like, nope, we're still going to talk about this. We've still done this work. We're still proud of it. We're still going to go forward and try and get something out of this. And it kind of meant that when it came to our interview at the end of exploration, our pitch, we were sort of a bit like, well, this would be brilliant, but we're already pushing it further than we thought we were anyway, if that makes sense. And applying to speak at a conference in the US after I'd had 2 glasses of red wine and was in my pajamas was one of the ways that we did
that. Sorry, I've got ahead of myself here as well. Really watch the video. I think that's normally the best articulation of what someone's looking for. And you're on mute, Chloe.
No, I was just saying, I was just mumbling to Jay that I remember you saying this to us, and I watched the video so many times and I took so many notes, and by the end of it I was like, if I ever have to hear these men speak again, I'm going to cry, and now I have to talk to them every day. It was a really good tip.
Because it is just, I think it's a sort of challenge of human communication. It's hard for them to articulate what they're looking for in 20 minutes, and unless you're already an expert in this area, you don't really know. There is a problem that they are struggling to articulate with knowing their world of systems and problems and policies, and so each time you watch it, you just sort of put the pieces together a bit more, and you can play back like what are the, if you just think like, here are 5 key phrases, and then we're going to use those in the deck because we know, or in the presentation because we know these things really sound like their key articulation of what they're trying to do, and if you can just play that back to them and then phrase your structure around it. So this is actually, I think, more if you get onto the next stage, and is that but it also applies to the video, is that like really hard listening of in detail what, and that challenge of what are they after, but also how can we present something that's even better and challenge. But I think it's rather than ignoring them if you don't like what they're saying, it's like, how do you challenge what they're saying in a way that feels like it's 2 + 2 = 5, and you're kind of growing together in your understanding of the problem. This is, I think, once you get to the PCA stage, so just a little bit further down the line, this was a tip from, there's another team who I helped last year called Supply 25, and I think this is a little bit like that kind of don't get phased. You're the experts now. You just have to kind of show that sense of leadership. The relationship on these projects isn't the typical client agency relationship where you're being told what to do and you implement it. It's more like you're running a startup and you have the vision and you've got your first client and they're paying you money, so you're very grateful to them and you really listen to them and you try and meet their needs, but you don't just go into the meeting and list down the things they're saying and then implement them. You are more, you just lead the whole thing. So I think that's really the end of my tips. Any questions or suggestions or Alice?
Thank you. It's been really helpful. For those of you that have applied, you've talked about 2 of you being on the project. Andy, how many were on yours? I know you've done 2 of them.
So the first one, we were kind of a small digital agency at the time, so there were 5 of us in the company, but there were like 2 of us who were really like fully focused on the application process. And then the second one I did, actually, it was kind of similar. What was different second time round was when we won it, we then shut down the agency because we thought this is such an amazing opportunity. Let's give it 100% of our lives for the next 18 months. But also the budgets had gone up from 200 grand to 600 grand. So yeah, it was always, I mean, I do think there is a benefit to 2 or 3 people being nimble, giving it as much focus as possible. I think one of the reasons the bigger companies struggle is if you're trying to navigate getting 10 people into a room and you spend half your time scheduling meetings rather than getting on with stuff.
I have a comment on that one. So the contract that we won at the end of this process was £720,000, and off the back of that contract, we've essentially built a company. That contract has replaced a fundraising round for us, so that's excellent in some ways because we still have all of our equity, so we have it on hand to give to future employees and future investors if we want to, and you just don't get that deal anywhere else. Like globally, I don't think it's possible to get a deal that good anywhere else. But the flip side of it for us has been, like, I hesitate to describe it as an albatross, but that there are certainly downsides, I think, to having a like someone who where the dynamic, because of the amount that they're providing to you, is more like an investor than a customer sometimes. You often find yourself balancing what you need to appease this first customer versus the wider market, because this might not be the case for everyone, but like we want to build something that can service the market as a whole rather than just our CivTech sponsor. So increasingly we're finding that what our sponsor wants, who is a government, has needs that are quite distinct from what our second, third, fourth, and so on customers are going to want. So it's just an added little intricacy that you need to manage when you get to that stage, we've found. Does that make sense?
I definitely agree with that. One thing I would say is you get so much freedom once you get through to that stage that you can easily get to a scenario where you're doing kind of 75% of the work for that first client and have a separate work stream which is more about the more generalizable solution. And compared to Innovate UK, when we won an Innovate UK grant, and I reckon we spent like 50% of our time on documentation of like filling in timesheets and uploading stuff and trying to say what we did by the hour. They really do treat you like adults on this program and give you a fair amount of freedom to just spend that money as well as you can. There's like, for us, we've set it up so there's every 2 months we have a check gate and we have to show we've made some progress, so we can kind of swan off to the Caribbean with it, but we do have freedom to do the best we can. Yeah, Nana?
Hi everyone. Thanks for all of this. Is really useful. So yeah, I just wanted to ask, we have built a earlier prototype. We've got one customer at the moment, as an example, which is a government customer. It's a government organization. We came across this challenge one of the challenges that seems to align with that. But is it in our, should we be, is in our favor to be malleable around the fact that it's not just the government we want this product to service, we want it to be other commercial entities as well? Or should we be quite specific around, yeah, we've got this customer who is a government organization and we want to continue down that road? I don't know if that makes sense.
Do you mind sharing what the challenge is? And
Yeah, it's 10. Yeah,
this,
10.7.
is that one of the ones that the government is sponsoring, or is it another organisation?
Sorry, do you mean in terms of what we've done already, or the specific?
No,
challenge?
sorry, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What's the challenge?
It's 10.7. It's the public participation challenge.
Right. Yeah. For that one, I think it depends exactly what team you get, but I would always say it would be in your benefit to be like, no, we want to make this a commercially successful thing that can serve a whole market rather than just you.
Mm-hmm.
So your odds are probably best to take them seriously and be willing to shape it based on their feedback. But the whole point of the CivTech program is to make you a successful company, not just to get that technology in. You know, like they want you to be successful and they want you to get other customers.
Cool.
So they'll look well on that.
But also, if I understood the other part of what you were saying, the fact you've already got some funding and one government client, I'd be totally upfront about that. I'd be, because I think they're happy to be the kind of seed funder or the kind of person who accelerates you along. So if this CivTech would be client number 2 and it's building on some amazing progress you've made with client number 1, I'd completely lean into that and use that as your head start and your USP. To the extent of which, when you're really listening to their challenge, you think you're solving it. I mean, I guess that's the challenge when you've got existing software, is you're further down the line, you've got more to share, but it may be a sort of 90% of a solution to what they're really asking for, and so how you bridge that gap requires a lot of thinking.
I think you'd have to be open to, like, if you really want to get to the end of the challenge, you'd have to be open to like completely changing what you've got if that's what the evidence suggests, I think.
Cool. That's fair. That's a good shout. Perfect. Thank you. That's really useful. Thanks.
And then, if anyone's got any challenges, sorry, go for it, Joel.
Hey, I just had a question. Did you find you, in your experience, you focused on one particular challenge that you were particularly passionate about, had a lot of experience on, rather? Because we're kind of generalists. There's a couple that are interesting in different ways, and we're trying to work out what the best way of approaching it is. Because they say you can apply for multiple ones, but I'm not sure, for the amount of time investment and the amount of commitment you're needing to show, I'm not sure how realistic that is.
We applied for 4.
4, okay.
Yeah, so we were in your position as well. Like we weren't digital identity experts before this process.
All right.
I mean, I don't know about you, Andy. Were you an expert on your thing?
No, not really. I think I've applied 3, so I've applied for 6, 7, and 8, but I think I only ever did 1 each year. I think they're evaluated independently, so I think there's nothing to stop you applying for a bat if you've got energy and time, and probably.
And although it does take a lot of time to put in a really killer application, these forms are not that complicated compared to some of the tenders that we were doing at that time, and we were putting in like 3 or 4 tenders a week at that time. So the idea of doing 4 of these applications, we didn't balk at.
Also, a lot of it's reusable. Like there's quite a lot of the kind of team diversity, the top and the bottom. It's just the meat of it. It needs to be different.
Okay.
If anyone's got a kind of project they want to work on but are looking for a partner, feel free to either shout out in the chat or verbally, if maybe not. But I remember last time there was 2 people got chatting because they were approaching the same project from different perspectives.
I just wanted to say that storytelling and user research point is, for us, was like I mean, that was how we worked anyway. So when Andy told us that this time last year, we were like, brilliant, we know how to do that. And we really, really lent into it. And it made all the difference, because none of the other companies on our challenge cared enough to do that. They thought that they already had the answers. So when we went there with literally arms and full of research that we'd done over that 3 weeks, it just informed everything, and it really, really impressed them. So I just wanted to reiterate that.
And I think it's great for, you know, a lot of the people here from, if you're from Agencies for Good, where you kind of, I think a lot of people in that world, and that's the world I came from, are used to doing user research and storytelling, and then you come up with government procurement projects where you just can't do any of that. So it's lovely here to have that chance where you can be more story led and vision led rather than ticking the boxes. Joe, you had a question, sorry, that flashed up for a second.
No, I think like the user research really, yeah, and that's something we always bake into everything. Did you do some user research prior to even the initial applications for the 4 challenges?
We actually did like a what was it we called it? Something day. I can't remember what it was.
We did an innovation day.
Yeah, we did an innovation day with like a few of our like the people who were contracting with us at the time, because they were interested in it. And ironically, the one that we won was the one that was hardest to get any interest in. The first time I read it, I was like, I don't really even understand this. And then as I started to do more secondary research into it, I realized what actually this is like an access problem. And it's about getting people access to the vital services that they need. And then I suddenly became very excited about it. So the research that we did before, we sort of did probably more thinking and innovation and workshop stuff among our really small team before we put that application in, more so than doing loads of research. You know, we read a couple of papers, and that was sort of it for the initial application. And then it was when we got to exploration that we just, I think I spent 2 of those 3 weeks on the phone. There's no point investing loads and loads of time into doing research before you do the initial application. They're more interested in you approaching this innovatively and your idea being well thought out than they are it being based in their knowledge of it.
Yeah.
That's what we found anyway.
Thank you.
Any more for any more? Well, good luck to everyone who goes for it. Do feel free to either, I think we're all on the Agencies for Good Slack, or I shared my email. I'm sure Chloe and Jay would be happy to chat as well. Vouchsafe,
Yeah,
not
sure.
IT. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
Really helpful. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye, everyone.